Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. I'm your host, Jeff Yan. In this episode, you will hear part one of my conversation with Rebecca Thomas, Director of the Pathways ePortfolio program and Adjunct Assistant Professor of the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department at Bucknell University. More links and information about today's conversation can be found on Digication's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Full episodes of Digication Scholars Conversations can be found on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. I'm your host, Jeff Yan. My guest today is Rebecca Thomas, Director of the Pathway ePortfolio program and Adjunct Assistant Professor of the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department at Bucknell University. Hello, Rebecca.
Hello, Jeff.
It's so nice to have you here on Digication Scholars Conversations. You are amongst your colleague, Joe Tranquillo, who was in our season 2, episode 25. We had a wonderful, wonderful conversation then, and I'm glad that you can join us now. And I know that actually there are a few other Bucknell colleagues of yours that we'll be talking to as well, because you're all just doing really incredible work. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, Rebecca, you're the director of the Pathways ePortfolio program. Do you want to just right away talk about what that means? What's Pathways? For those who might be listening, may have some idea, but not really 100% sure what that means.
Yeah. So, Pathways is Bucknell's university-wide ePortfolio initiative. It's a fairly new program at Bucknell. It rolled out 2 years ago, so we have 2 years of the program. And so it has a lot of goals for students to kind of take control of their own learning, right? To integrate all their great experiences that they have when they come to a school like Bucknell, and think holistically about their learning and who they are. And we focus that mostly in the development of the ePortfolio.
Mm-hmm. When you say think holistic about themselves, I know that. I mean, of course, having talked to Joe, and for people who haven't heard that, I highly recommend you listen to Joe's conversation as well, because he's a master of metacognition and reflections, and he comes from this really interesting, diverse background. And one of the things that I often want to talk to people about is a lot of people say holistic learning, develop as a whole, human, and all of this stuff, right? So in your vision of this, as the director of this, and your vision, what does that really mean when a student, practically, if I'm a parent sending a student to Bucknell now, you're telling your student, your child is going to be holistically learning about themselves, right, and being developed in that way. What does that really mean in practical terms?
Right. So, I mean, I mentioned Bucknell students are very involved. They do a lot of things around campus, right? Going to classes is just one of them. So part of the holistic experience, right, is that they're involved in lots of different organizations, right? It's a very residential campus, so most of our students live together and work together outside of class. So they have all these experiences to bring in. Also, personally, I come from the STEM background, where a lot of times, the technical part is really focused on. And, right, there's this, even though we know technology has human aspects, right? We tend to think we can separate those and ignore the human part, and really we can't. So, coming from STEM, I think not ignoring the human part, also not ignoring the humanities is really important, because right? Where, we're all trying to solve these bigger, more complex, relevant to society problems. And we need a bigger lens, a bigger view to do that. So, so we need to think about lots of aspects of the problem, not only the technical, but the human side and how it overlaps with all, other aspects, the social, the political, the economic, to come up with real plausible solutions to these problems that we're facing.
I think that's really awesome and really great to see. Like I think that it's no secret to many people that if you're going into the STEM fields, you yourself are in the engineering and computer, electrical and computer, engineering department. Um, a lot of folks have this view that in a STEM field, you do everything is very black and white, is very right or wrong. You have the answer, you don't have the answer.
I
Um,
wish it was like
right?
that. It would be a
Right?
lot simpler.
So that's wrong, right? That's the wrong way to look at it. So I think that's actually a really interesting. That's a really interesting thing that you're saying because I've had so many colleagues. Of course, I know a lot of my work has evolved around portfolio. Many of the schools that we have worked with, um, I've known these folks for a long time, and many of them have this um, idea that it's much easier to do ePortfolio because it's touchy feely. It's talking about reflection and that you can do it easier in the arts, in the humanities, but not in STEM. They think that STEM, oh, of course, we're not going to be doing STEM programs. That's harder. That's not the low hanging fruit. What do you say to that? Because I don't think that that's justified. Do you?
No, I mean, and I think, naturally, like some of the historical ways that e-portfolios have been used and kind of where they started was more for the professional programs. Right. So, like nursing and education are big fields for e-portfolios, right? And engineering, in some sense of what we do, is a very um, professional degree, professional path, right? We are
Mhm.
educating the students um, that we have to be engineers, right? There's a wide variety of engineers you can be, and we're actually trying to push on and expand that with what I'm doing in my department and what we believe ePortfolios can do for STEM
Mhm.
majors, right? But I think you have that traditional view. So it's interesting at Bucknell. Engineers are actually leading the way with our ePortfolio initiative.
Mhm.
Um, Particularly my department and electrical and computer engineering has already tried it in I think 6 different courses. We're looking to create a new course that we want students to actually enroll in every single semester. It'll be a small portion, right? So it adds up to a whole course over their 8 semesters. Um, but we want students to do this so that they can think about and narrate and document their experience the whole way through their curriculum and bring in the other parts of it won't be a very technical course, so the things they're pulling, the experiences they're thinking about in their portfolio should come from a wide range of what they're doing as different parts of their education.
Yeah, I really think that it's potentially more important than what people are even thinking about, because I think that engineers today, and I know in the field of, for example, in computer engineering, and especially in the sort of subfield of the artificial intelligence, um, this very idea of understanding societal issues, understanding ethics, understanding values, and how to how to think empathetically, right? How to implement respect in society, right? These are kind of things that an engineer could have tremendous power. They can wield, they can, the things that the decisions that they make, the approach that they take into solving a problem could have lots of unintended consequences down the road if they are not careful and carefully thinking through these implications. Don't you?
Yeah. Um, I think that's definitely, engineers can have a lot of impact, right? They often have a lot of power, um, right? But some engineers and some engineering students don't want to think about those larger aspects. They want to,
Mm.
or well, and sometimes that's the training is like you do what you're told and you don't
Right. Right. So there's that.
beyond that. Yeah.
Right. So
And
there's
so,
that.
that wanting things to be black and white, right?
Mhm. Yep.
Your client tells you to do this, if you're a consultant or your boss tells you to do this and you deliver, right? You don't ask why. You
Mhm.
don't think about the broader implications sometimes.
Right.
Um,
Right. And I think that in many ways, you know, I hear this a lot. By the way, I used to be the school that I used to teach at is an art and design school at Rhode Island School of Design, and I used to hear this a little bit. This is quite interesting, I think. Like we have a film department, and a lot of the people that make films from that department would make films that they don't look like what you'll see in the movies because they are very abstract. Sometimes they're like, what is this like crazy idea? Technically they're not perfect. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Um, and and I remember talking to someone and going, so do they come out of the school having the skills to go in and make films? And they go, and sometimes people go, well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. They really need to still then learn in industry and like learn the ropes. But what you will find is that there are also some film schools that are highly technical. By the time they graduate, they just know how to shoot a film, um, technically, but they haven't explored in how to tell the story. They haven't explored on some of the more abstract, higher level sort of thinking. So if you then fast forward 10 years, the people that came out having all of the technical skills are still doing the same job that requires all of the technical skills. Actually, our students are the ones that, for in some ways, because they don't have those technical skills, they kind of have to sort of, go in the path of we're just going to make the movie. We're going to have to hire people to have the technical skills. And they ended up leading. They ended up becoming the directors of the movies and the creators of the shows. Isn't that kind of interesting?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in engineering though, like we definitely can't ignore those technical skills. We definitely need to equip our students to have those, but right, we can teach those and still think about the context, right?
Mhm.
And think about integrating them and transferring them more. Um, right. Sometimes in engineering, we get so focused on everything has to be technical and they need to go
Yeah.
so deep in the technical. Yet, right, the field advances so quickly and the variety of things that students go out to do is so wide that they're going to have to learn some of that technical aspects on the job. So, right. So a lot of what we're doing, right, is giving them the skills to be able to learn
Mhm.
those aspects. Yeah. But we do see kind of the same thing with, engineers that have these broader skills, right? They're gonna be the ones that move up and they're gonna be the ones who are um kind of supervisors or project managers, right? They're not going to stay in those technical jobs
Mhm. Right.
usually.
And do you see in your experience difference between this current generation of students that are from your program because they are being exposed to these, like the humanities and the purposes of, in the society and so on. Do you see a difference between them and I don't know, students who haven't been exposed to that, including perhaps I'm perhaps making assumptions here, but maybe your own personal experience or students that you've seen in your own education experiences, maybe classmates when you were a student who may not have been exposed to those things. Do you see a difference between them?
Um, yeah, I think mostly in kind of what we've talked about in their kind of longer term path, right? And I would like to see it kind of earlier on, right? But a lot of people still graduate wanting to go to those big programs, wanting to be at the Googles and the Microsofts and
Mhm.
um yeah, and not thinking I'd love to see students think even more broadly about, all right, I have an engineering degree. What what good can I do with it? Or what can I do with it too that really interests me and is something that I care about?
Right. Right. It could be anything from, creating justice in the society to solving a impossible problem such as, clean water or or curing, a deadly disease, or figuring out how to apply those skills that you have to mental health and things like that, right?
Mhm.
So in other words, almost like opening up the possibilities. So it's not yes, if you get if you're an engineer, if you're qualified, those jobs at Google and Microsoft sounds pretty
Prestigious.
lucrative,
Yeah.
prestigious, and
Yeah.
sort of cushy, like that would be it. Like that's when my parents, would be happy. I think that that's what my parents would have wanted me to do when I was when I was coming up.
Mhm.
I didn't do it. It was a disappointment to them in that regard. Um, what was your story like? I mean, you also studied, engineering, and how did you end up at Bucknell?
Yeah, so, I think early I went in being an engineer who wanted to, like, make the world a better place, right? Make things better for people, and, right, I spent 4 years in undergrad and kinda graduated and didn't know how to make that happen, had no
Hmm.
idea where to go from there. Um,
So
yeah,
let me pause for a minute there, okay? Because I think this is really interesting. Like, really is. So you got a 4-year undergraduate degree at that point. Is it right to say that you probably at least feel like you've gained some skills? You got the technical skills?
mhm, yeah,
So you knew how to solve a problem if someone said, "Here's a problem, go solve it," in
yeah,
your area of study. But you still feel like that I
and
don't
I
know
knew how
what
to
to
get a
do.
job that would pay the bills,
Ah,
but
right.
I didn't know how to
Mm,
do something that would really be fulfilling.
yeah. And
And
that's, by the way, a huge part of this generation.
Right.
I think you're a bit younger than me, but when I was growing up, like fulfillment was a very luxurious thing to have. Like you don't get to have that and pay the bills at the same time. You just kind of, get a job and you'll get fulfilled in other ways. Once you make money, you'll get fulfilled. But it's not true. It's not true. In fact, many people have made lots of money, and I know a lot of them in Silicon Valley. They actually, in fact, made this proportionate amount of money that they didn't know what to do with, and still feel an incredible sense of emptiness and a sense of depression. Some of them, in fact, they felt like that now that I've reached the end, I'm supposed to see the rainbow. and the rainbow is nowhere to be found,
Mhm.
you know?
But yeah, I decided though, since I didn't know professionally how to change things, that I would educate future engineers that
Mm,
hopefully could then have more opportunities to change things, right? And being an educator is a nice place to like continually be able to do that, to influence the next up and coming engineers over and over again.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's it's amazing because I think that this is exactly the kind of both the modeling but the thought process that allows you to direct the program that has that inherently built into the concepts of how you structure things, even just one that you talked about, which is this idea of a cross that's going to span across 8 semesters. They're going to do a little work every semester, but
Yeah.
it's always going to remind them, hey, where's your true north? Where's
Yeah.
your what is going to keep driving you as you gain more and more skills, right? Now you know how to create something in a database. Now you're creating some code. Now you can do this logic that you couldn't do before. Now you're doing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. But where's your true north, and are you still pointing in that direction? I think
And
that's amazing.
yeah. But I mean, and there are a lot of students too, like first generation students. I was a first gen, right? So I came in not knowing where my north
Oh,
was,
yes.
not knowing where to go.
Right,
So I
right.
think it is a balance though of you know guiding the students who need
Mhm.
help finding it,
Yeah,
but yeah, also kind of continually doing that because you change a lot in your 4 years that
yeah.
you are in university. So right, thinking about what it is that you want to do, how is that changed? Is it changing? Or are you still focused on?
Mhm.
I guess I was still focused on my goal to make the world better. Right.
Yeah. But in ways that you didn't think was even a possible path when you first started. And I will share that I'm also a first gen college attendee in my
Yeah,
family, and, I would say that, even forget I don't know where the true north is. I didn't even know you're supposed to have a north.
yeah,
Do you know what I mean? It's maybe the only north for me conceptually would have just been to survive, just be like be be able to pay the bills.
yeah.
That was about
Get
it.
the degree, get a job, get
Yeah.
just a little bit of
Yeah. Degree, job, and then you can figure it out.
yeah,
I think that's too late. I think that it feels too late, don't you?
yeah. Well,
Or
I
at
I
least not
think
very
you're
efficient,
missing
right?
out.
Yeah.
You're missing out on a lot of
Yeah.
what education can provide if you're very
Yeah.
focused on that. But
And I think that this is actually a really good um place for me to talk about sort of just education in general, because Um, I have spoken with a lot of folks in this very, Digication Scholars Conversations, right, and from different fields and whatnot. And they would oftentimes have to defend, folks are in liberal arts, folks that are in the arts, especially, they have to defend that, this is a viable path because you're learning to be a better human. Um, Oftentimes, comparing to if you're an engineer, because like you said, there is this sort of pre-established path that is pretty cushy.
uh,
I don't it's never easy, by the way, but it seems easier. It seems more laid out for you. Like the path is there, you can follow the steps, and if you're pretty decent, you can do it. You can do it just like someone else had done, and just kind of that's it, right? And then you could be in this position of a multiple six-figure job with lunch and dinner covered, and dry cleaning also done for you, etc. It's kind of like it sounds amazing, um and but I think that, um like what you were saying, to find that fulfillment, that may not be it, and that actually, regardless of which field you're going into, that fulfillment, you still need to work at it and search for it, and then exercise somehow to get there, right?
Yeah.
And that's not different for an engineer versus a dance major, don't you think?
Yeah. But I think it's probably easier as an engineer to not realize that part's important.
Right, because the other path is so it's there. It's
Mhm.
like that. In fact, that's the dare I say, more the norm, societal norm, if anything, you know, um, and because it's both elusive, but because it's there, you can sort of just catch it, but it's also very seductive because it's like I want that, like if you are the student, you're like, that sounds pretty good. Having a lot of money, having a lot of resources, people are taking vacations all the time, what's not to like kind of situation, right?
Yeah. And having the stability, which I think is a big benefit of engineering. It does give you the stability to do things to do the other things you want with the money that you have and
Mhm.
hopefully the time that you have, when you're not doing that, but when you're not working.
Right.
Um but yeah, if you're I still think you can miss out on a lot.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that a lot of people have probably the wrong view of what the STEM field and engineers especially do, and perhaps even engineers themselves, is that many people think of engineers are the experts at problem solvers. You have a problem, we'll engineer our way out of it. We'll engineer a solution. But I think that sort of true to how you were talking about, if they're exposed to societal issues, if they're exposed to what's the most important things in the world today, um, be it climate change or super intelligence, AI, and possible future pandemics that is even more deadly than COVID, right? All of these areas actually perhaps less so than being a great problem solver, you have to be a great sort of identifier of problems.
Uh,
And that's a hugely under sort of represented part of engineering, I feel. Like I said, even to engineers themselves, because many students
yeah,
are like, I've been trained for 12 years before coming to Bucknell, in high school and whatnot, to solve problems. I'm really good at it, right? If they come to a school like Bucknell, they're probably pretty good at whatever they were doing already, right?
yeah,
And so I'm really good at doing that. I'm just great at solving problems, but but the engineers feels to me is very incomplete, and that's why you don't get that fulfillment if you're also not able to be the one who instigate the problems.
yeah. And that's a big part of what we do in our design thread and our department, especially with senior design, right? And students get a senior design problem, they just want to start making the solution right away, right? They've got an idea maybe within 5 minutes how they're going to solve it, and they want to start building it. But we make them take our senior design is a year long course. They take it both semesters. So we make them spend almost the entire first semester actually going out and figuring out more about what the problem is, right? We They have to interview people and talk to people and really define the problem and figure out what's all involved before they're allowed to
Yeah,
propose a solution and start working on it.
yeah. Um, Seems like what's interesting is that there's something about, and I don't know whether I'm being overly generalizing here, but I think there's almost something about sort of a almost a lot of typical gender differences as well. A lot of men loves to go into, if they hear a problem, they want to just go and to the solution, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
It
I
may not
remember
be we may not be
like,
looking for a solution yet.
that
And a
was
lot of
something we covered in, like, counseling before we got married, is men typically want to, like, solve your problem.
yeah,
Husbands do. The wives, like, typically want to be heard and talk about the problem.
right.
But
We have to have I mean, it's a engineering, especially, and a lot of the STEM field is heavily still today dominated by sort of by male participants. But to
for
me, it's
sure.
not just the
Yeah.
participants; it's also the ideas, it's the approach that are very masculine, um, in a in a bad way, in a way that doesn't balance like what you just said, which is, hey, look, we got to spend almost, if not the same amount of time on asking the questions before you just go into the solution, part of this, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, one of the big keys to addressing these problems are to get closer to equity within the field, right? Have more women representation, and there are lots of other underrepresented groups, not just women,
Of
but
course. Mhm.
right, um, is have more diversity and
Have you seen that at
lit.
Bucknell?
Um, I mean, it's definitely a big push
Mhm.
here, and some departments do better than others. I
Mhm.
think it's just based on kind of where the field is. But yeah, I think though, we have come a long way in 100 years. Bucknell graduated its first female engineer 100 years ago, like in May we celebrated that.
Uh-huh.
So that's awesome. And
Yeah.
there are a lot more women here than there were, but also it's been 100 years and like we haven't made as much progress as we should have,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
We're still maybe 10-20% in some departments. Um, right. So, I think we need to think about the framework that we're working in and, the stories that we tell and ePortfolios. I think it's a good way to widen this view of what is an engineer, right?
Yeah.
It does have this fairly narrow typical identity that we define to it. Um, and if we can think more broadly about who can be an engineer and what they might do, what they're interested in, right? That they should think about the problem and think about the human aspects. Um, yeah, I think those kind of big changes need to be happening along with the
Mhm.
the recruitment and the
Here's a preview of what's coming up next in part two of my conversation with Rebecca Thomas, director of the Pathways ePortfolio program at Bucknell University.
I think we're opening up that door and I think though based on what the current generation of students is concerned with that yeah we should see more of them kind of going down that path.